Hey gang, I've gone on a fairly deep dive into everything we've seen so far for Total War 40k, and today we're going to talk about how Legendary Lords and Heroes will most likely work, and what we can expect from the faction customization system by looking at the tabletop changes coming with 11th edition this summer. I've lumped Legendary Lords in with the customization in this video because the more you think about them, the more you realize how much these two subjects interact. In Total War Warhammer 3, we have Legendary Lords and Legendary Heroes. These are mainly named characters from Warhammer lore, with a few others made up by Creative Assembly with the approval of Games Workshop. Heroes are a newer addition and not necessarily named characters, but lone elite units who can go off by themselves or with a small retinue to do their own missions and adventures, or join into the Lord's main army. Lords have fairly unique skill trees and traits that determine how the army they lead will play. For example, one Lord might have heavy buffs for vehicles with debuffs to infantry, and another Lord would specialize more in infantry combat with nerfs to cavalry units. In the Warhammer Fantasy series, Creative Assembly only pay Games Workshop for access to the Fantasy IP. This means they can add characters, units, and factions from Fantasy to Warhammer 3. This includes factions that never had minis or playable armies on Tabletop Fantasy, such as Grand Cathay, of which the popularity and success pushed GW to make and release Grand Cathay for the Old World on Tabletop, and fans assume this means a Kislev tabletop release in the future too. But as a company, like all companies, they don't like to spend money. So they frequently come to cliffs where named characters are locked behind other IP titles from GW. The most well-known of these locks in the Warhammer 3 community is the Vampire Counts DLC. Creative Assembly were only able to add 2 Dreadfleet characters to the game without needing to fork out to GW for access to the rest of the Dreadfleet IP. So they created Silostra Diafin and Aranessa. On the small print at the end of the announcement and gameplay trailer, it only has Warhammer 40k listed. I would have expected Battlefleet Gothic or Epic as well, but this can help us with what to expect in terms of the Void units, Void battles, and how the Galactic Map or Crusade Theatre will work. But I'll make this a separate video to cover Battlefleet Gothic and other games with naval combat after this. We can more or less confirm that we're getting some version of Legendary Lords to lead our armies. In this shot of the Crusade Theatre, we can see Calgar in the top left, so there must be a Legendary Lord type figure you can use. But in the battleground shots, you can see the units in your army in the bottom left, but there's no Calgar frame, so can we even play as the Lords on battlegrounds? And we also have this immensely in-depth army customization, where alongside picking homebrew colours and iconography is a super in-depth character and faction creation tool. So let's unpack this one at a time. It kind of looks like a no, or that there will be a more free mode of sending battalions on missions without a direct leader. From these shots from the trailer, I think it's a safe assumption to say that your chosen lord, in this case Calgar, is just the face for your campaign, and all of your void ships are able to travel and command themselves without needing a legendary lord present physically. Whether this will be in the form of legendary heroes like chaplains or company captains, at least in terms of Space Marines, who will report to the chapter master Calgar, making the decisions of where to send them. This does make sense for the setting, as Vox communications between ships and planets are a very common thing in 40k for all factions except maybe orcs. From what we know about the gameplay, the Galactic Map, or Crusade Theatre, will act as a sandbox, from where we can swoop down into solar systems for the classic Total War large campaigns, or into shorter games they've named flashpoints on singular planets. And those games will push the narrative forward in the Crusade Theatre, like a personal real-time galactic story, kinda like how the Helldivers narrative changes and reacts depending on the planets players decide to attack or defend. Again, I will look at this gameplay and build of Total War 40k in the video after this, so don't worry. Returning to Calgar, and to be fair, as much as this is a kind of build your own story and playing out battles from lore, it's still lore accurate to the Warhammer 40k IP and future advancements in the 40k narrative. So if you manage to kill Calgar in your Total War game, then you personally will be responsible for GW promoting Titus to Chapter Master of the Ultramarines. And then if we get Primarchs, and you manage to kill Guilliman, well, we can only imagine what Belisarius Cawl will do to get Primarch Titus, and it'll be all your fault. That said, we can also assume from previous Total War games that we will get characters from lore to play as, so we can RP as big name characters like Dante of the Blood Angels, or Typhus of the Death Guard, or potentially a Legion's Primarch if they have a living one, which would be really cool to be able to do. The other challenge would be the skill trees and traits for characters from lore and balancing those things with the mass customization we've been told we're getting. If you've ever played tabletop Warhammer, in your army list you have to take an epic hero or a character model that you can make a warlord. For example, in my Death Guard list here, I have Mortarion, famously the Primarch of the Death Guard. He fights on tabletop, so it would be weird to have these lords be stuck in the Crusade theatre and not get into the war zones. Then you pick a detachment. There are big changes coming in 11th this summer that I think tell us how the customization will work in regards to detachments and skill trees in Total War. So in 11th, we'll have detachment points, which you'll be able to spend on one whole army affecting detachment or up to 4 more specific unit-focused detachments depending on the size of the game. This was designed to allow you to make more homebrewed feeling armies and make games more unique and varied depending who you're playing against. This to me feels a lot like the push Total War 40k is going, with trying to get people to make their own heroes with the deep customization for a new chapter, Legion, Craftworld, Hive Fleet, Dynasty, etc. to play as. In Total War, I would expect this to be shown in the skill trees. You still pick an army from a codex like on tabletop, and then have that main army rule and keywords, but then have the detachment options as various skill trees to go down, and traits to pick from, and unit specialization decisions. When the homebrewing angle was announced, I was leaning towards you pick a faction such as Adeptus Astartes, and then the skill tree would essentially be traits, buffs, and stratagems from all the legions and chapters. So you could build a new legion with base skills from Blood Angels and Raven Guard, almost like picking a gene seed flavor, and then filling it out with a pick and mix from smaller blessings and atonements from successor chapter themed branches. Now though, I think it will be a bit more streamlined, with rather than picking a larger overarching faction, like Adeptus Astartes, you pick a codex like Ultramarines to be your base, and then have trees for the different successors of Ultramarines. And with lore characters like Calgar, this is where the uncertainty is. The campaign is a sandbox, and the enemy AI, we assume, will just use default legendary lords, so there will need to be default setups they can use without a randomizer eating your CPU to pick the next option, especially as this is going to release on consoles, which do not have very powerful CPUs. Let's stick with Calgar. He will have unique traits to him and access to the Adeptus Astartes skill tree, but as a named character and Games Workshop's need for lore accuracy, I feel like this skill tree will be pruned to be more towards how you would play Calgar on tabletop. For a custom warlord, I somewhat doubt that you would be able to use those named characters' unique traits, and you would only be able to pick and choose from the more kind of generic depending on the faction you've chosen. This way you wouldn't be able to make your own Calgar, but potentially broken, as I can imagine the unique traits in named lore characters will take the place of some skill tree options, especially if those named characters have unique skill trees. So for example, if there is a Calgar trait to massively buff Power Fists, and then there's a generic skill tree to spec into a Power Fist based army, you could potentially end up with a super broken Power Fist that could commit Exterminatus from across the map. Basically, the super in-depth customization raises a lot of question marks over legendary lords. The push toward people making homebrew factions in Total War 40k is a big one, so how will Creative Assembly manage DLC for 40k? If we're getting these specific traits, unique trees, and mechanics for named lore characters that aren't able to be picked outside of the character they are unique to, then they can just do DLC as they normally do, selling packs of named characters for various factions that potentially come with specialist units and new cosmetics. From what we've seen and heard of the customization system, it is largely a painting suite and iconography builder, so having to buy a DLC to get sculpted armor, like the DLCs for Space Marine 2 for example, wouldn't be a far stretch. We also haven't seen the iconography creation system. In most games with this type of thing, it relies on the player to layer basic shapes like circles, squares, triangles, to create a more complex shape. So maybe buying a Typhus character DLC will unlock more shapes in that creator or official Typhus iconography, for example. However, you then have factions like the Tyranids. They don't really have any named characters. They still have leaders though. I reckon we will have legendary lords and heroes. It wouldn't be a Total War game without someone in charge. But I think heroes will work more as single void ships who can either join in the main lord's fleet or go off by themselves, and the lords will be on their own void ship, but be able to deploy and fight. Traits and skill trees will have seemingly limitless generic ones to pick from for a custom lord, and the default named characters will come with a unique loadout of traits and skill tree options that you can't pick in the customizer. I will be posting more over time about Total War 40k, so let me know if there's anything more specific you want me to look into or talk about. I stream on here and Twitch, so come hang out and chat or join my Discord linked below. As always, thanks for watching, like this video, subscribe, potentially become a channel member for fancy Discord channels and content polls, TYTY, and see ya.